those who don't know who I am, my name is Nichole Embertson. I work at the Whatcom Conservation District just across the street, and I'm a nutrient management specialist. And so I work primarily with dairies, but I work with kind of anywhere manure goes. That's kind of what I work with for the most part. So grazing systems, manure application systems, livestock systems, etc. So I do a lot of that. And today what I want to talk about is the interface of farming and water quality. So I'm not here in any way as a representative from Department of Ecology or the county or any other group that does water quality sampling. I'm just here today to talk to you about some of the different topics related to that, what water quality monitoring is done here in Whatcom County, where is that done, and all the various groups doing those things, how you can be a part of that if you want to be, and how to take your own samples and work with that, as well as what parts of agriculture actually contribute to water quality issues. And I'm going to talk both about surface water and groundwater. So both kind of issues, both modes of transportation of pollutants, if you will, down to these sources or over to these sources. And then a little bit about what are those impacts, what does that mean to you, and then ways that you can reduce any kind of pathway of movement of manure, etc., to those sources. So, and then as I go along, if you want more clarification, more explanation, you have a question, feel free to raise your hand or just interrupt me at any point. So I'm more than happy to address your questions as they come up, or we can talk about it at the end, or you can find me at any time to talk about those things. So first of all, I just kind of want to set the stage for Whatcom County. I know a lot of you probably already know this, but I just want to put it in context to our conversation today. So here we've got Whatcom County, and a couple things I want to highlight on here. So this big kind of light blue area, that's the Sumas Aquifer, Abbotsford Aquifer. So this is essentially the large aquifer that sits under Whatcom County, and this is where a lot of your water will come from if you're pumping from wells, either residential irrigation, livestock watering, etc. And it's a shared and very large aquifer. One thing to note is that this goes across the border. It doesn't stop at the border. So we do have some exchange with Canada as well. The water quality coming down, some of our surface waters going up. So it's important to note that and to address that. But it's a very large area. It's a big aquifer. And as a lot of you know, our water table comes to the surface in many areas of our county. So it can be next door to a field, just depending on what elevation you get a lull in or whatever it may be. So we definitely have a lot of surface water that comes up in our county, and a big fluctuation throughout the year. Another thing to note, as you probably all know, all these little blue lines, that's all surface water, and that's not all of it. In other words, we have a ton of pathways, either they're ditches or rivers or streams, etc. A lot of surface water moving around our county, and many opportunities for your field to contribute to that. And in a lot of ways, this is great because it's a drainage protection thing. So your fields that may be quite saturated, if you've got tiles or some kind of a drainage system, you can get water off there sooner, and you can get out there farming sooner. It may be better for your crops, etc. Getting it off the pasture so you can get animals out there sooner. Those are all really good things. But we want to make sure that when in your good management of those areas of your farm, that you're not contributing somehow to fecal coliform or sediment or nitrogen, etc., getting into those water bodies. So another big one. On here, just to diagram, since this is the Dairy Speaker Series, all the little red dots represent dairy facilities. Some of these are historic, some are current. It's kind of a mix, but it's kind of our 2008 census numbers. And what you can see is that there's a huge overlap of these facilities on this aquifer, in this water, etc. So we're married right up. So farming and water are right together, as they should be, right? You really don't have farming without water anyway. So, but we can have a really positive interaction here. In some cases, we have a negative interaction if we don't do the right management technique, but they're connected pretty heavily. So some interesting things about where our surface water goes. The whole Sumas kind of area here, that all your water actually kind of goes north up into Canada. So you're not kind of contributing to some of these other bays here. It actually tends to go more northward. Whereas we've got kind of anyone in the Nooksack Basin here, your water is going to typically drain to the Nooksack and end up here in the Portage Bay area. And then we've got California and Dakota Creeks This area typically drains up to Drayton Harbor, Portage Bay. Excuse me, I meant Bellingham Bay down here. So we've got different, wherever you live, you've got a different impact zone, if you will, for where that water is going to end up in its end zone. And so that just has an effect on who's doing monitoring in your area, what are kind of your downstream farming neighbors or et cetera that you want to be paying attention to in those areas. So it's nice to know where you live and in what watershed you are contributing and you're a neighbor and a community part of. So as I mentioned, we have a lot of not only dairy, but a lot of small livestock in this zone too, just as important. If I put all those dots on here, it would kind of obscure everything. And that's from, you've got 1 horse to you've got 100 beef cattle to some chickens. We have a lot of non-dairy livestock facilities in our county that are just as important to think about and talk about as a contributor. So a lot of times dairy gets the bad rap just because of historical measures or size, but that's not necessarily the case at all. So it's important to look at all of our different potential sources and address everybody equally. Again, we have a huge crop and berry production here. I single out berries because it's a really increasing area right now, or increasing crop, both raspberries and blueberries. And a lot of folks are turning over their land, and different types of soil types and land is going into those productions. For raspberries, for instance, when I start talking about leaching to groundwater, that's our more concern because they're on those nice, high, dry, sandy soil types. And those sandy soil types, if you came to my talk a few months ago talking about manure application on soil types, sandy soils tend to have a much faster infiltration rate. So they don't run off, but they certainly do go through the soil much quicker. So that's what we think about. So other types of, a lot of our corn ground is on really like thicker, saturated soil types, and we're not so concerned about leaching, but we certainly are concerned about runoff. If you drive around right now, you can see what fields kind of have standing water on them, and those are your bigger concern for runoff. So our different crop types, just by where they end up on soil types, really affect what your concerns are going to be, one or the other. So obviously we have a lot of natural resources, and it's salmon and shellfish that typically drive upstream what our concerns are, who's kind of putting the pressure on for dealing with those things, and the importance of the area for what are you affecting at the end point of that. So it's just, as I mentioned that, the only reason is really to think about what are you doing right here where you're standing on your farm, and how far reaching can that potential effect be. So just to give you a thought or a context about, yeah, it's easy for me to fix this, and if I do that, wow, I'll have a really positive benefit on the longer food chain, if you will. So how does a water pollution occur? And as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about the 2 different types, but we've got a handful of different things we're thinking about. So it's not just all thinking about fecal coliform all the time. We have a handful of other things. There's chemical component contributions like herbicides and pesticides, and these things are tested by ecology. They usually do spot checks once a year. It's different times that they'll do that, but those things are tested in our county occasionally. Sediments is a huge one. So not only are you losing soil off of your land surface, but if you came to our ag drainage talk that we had last go, having that kind of sediment get into your waterways just creates so much problems. I mean, it costs you a lot of money in having to dredge that and clean it up, and or having that dam up naturally with that accumulation of sediment, flooding your field or your neighbors upstream and causing crop damage. So sediment can just be a real pain from those aspects. And not only does it contribute to turbidity in the streams, which is what fish groups are more concerned about, because salmon can't actually swim up a stream if the turbidity is too high. So there's a lot of things with sediment that we're concerned about. The nutrient aspect, this is the nitrogen and phosphorus pieces. So a runoff concern, and that's also that leaching concern, and I'll talk more about how nitrogen is the biggest player in that. But when these nutrients move, some have an effect on our water bodies, some don't. Some of these nutrients have to get to a certain level, and they can have quite a big effect. And one of the biggest ones we see is phosphorus contributing to eutrophication, or that algae that comes up. And you can see that in kind of more stagnant water bodies, even a little bit of runoff of any type of a fertilizer, whether that's chemical or manure or whatever it may be. can create that, starting that algae plume, and can start to create that growth. So, and that really takes all the oxygen out of the water, and if that's a fish-bearing stream, then your oxygen content is lower because the plants are taking it, and then you have fish kills, or fish can't be in that water, or the natural aquaculture kind of ecology is disrupted. So a lot of different endpoint issues you can have with water there. And then the pathogens, so this is things, Fecal Coliform is the one we all hear about, but you've got E. coli and a few others. And when those get into water bodies, the endpoint, having something like shellfish at the mouth of many of our beds, where all the water from everybody ends up, they suffer greatly from that, because if the counts are too high, they have to shut down production, and they're farmers too. If the water went the other way, you'd probably be, just as upset with them if they were shutting down your milk production, if it went straight in there. So just a thought, thinking about kind of your neighbors and the kind of, I guess, community, if you will, of farmers that are affected different kinds down the line. So that's a big one. So there's a lot that can potentially make it in, depending on what type of farmer you are, what do you have on your land, how are you managing that can get there. As I mentioned, where do these come from? The chemical ones, obviously, this is from direct application of pesticides, herbicides, etc. The sediment is typically from just natural soil erosion. If you're not doing things like planting cover crops, or you don't have buffers or those types of things, you can just get natural soil loss depending on what your soil type is, and when that flooding occurs maybe, or you just have a lot of rain that's moving off of a fallow field, for instance, it's going to carry a lot of sediment. And things like manure, just because there's sediment particles in there, that can move and act as a sediment as well. The nutrients, so as I mentioned, that's manure and fertilizer. The pathogens can come from a lot of different sources. They can be manure, livestock, septic, wildlife, dogs, wastewater treatment plants, etc. Tons of different contributors. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as well in the next slides. And then other sources of any of these things, when we think about, this is mostly agriculture, but when we think outside of that, you've got humans, industry, wildlife. Dry deposition is basically whatever is in the atmosphere can dry deposit. Nitrogen does that, for instance. So you can have airborne, if you will, fertilization of natural areas, just because ammonia, for instance, can volatilize into the air and be carried and deposit within a few miles of its source. And so you do have movement of that. You can get contribution from those industrial sources as well into the air, and then deposition on land. So things have a way of moving all over. Rainwater does the same thing, so it's called wet deposition, but same idea. Forests, wetlands, all these areas contribute. So it's the point is that sometimes these sources are really, really hard to pinpoint who is contributing what, where, how, when. So that's where good sampling programs are really important. And it's for your vigilance also to know what's probably coming off of your land. So when we think about surface runoff specifically, the thing that's measured here in Whatcom County and typically is fecal coliform. So that's the major thing that is measured, especially to determine if it's agricultural-based runoff. And this has some pros and cons. The pro is that it is a direct indicator of fecal coliform, but that's directly linked to one of the cons, which says it is really, really hard to determine exactly what type of fecal coliform that is. Is it ruminant, human, avian? There are some methods that are still kind of in experimental stages, if you will, about RNA or DNA testing, about being able to put a catalog together that when you take that sample, you can figure out what species it is. But those methods are not really well refined, and they're very expensive in a lot of cases to do that sampling on a wide basis. So at this point, we just say, well, we found fecal coliform, and you have to assume source based on where you are. Not always the best method to really be able to know what it is. But one of the pros is with fecal coliform, you can, quote, call bracketing stream samples. You can do this with anything, and this is one aspect for figuring out runoff, is that you take one sample somewhere, you say, wow, we got a count of 1,000, for instance. And then you start moving upstream until that number goes down. And you can say, okay, we went over what could have been. Now we're down to, let's say, 20. And so now let's move back, and you can start bringing in those brackets to find exactly what point of the river was contributing to that source. And then you can start looking terrestrial on the land and figure out where did that come from. So that's one way to use this. Some of the other cons, though, you don't get immediate results. It takes a while to get these results back. So you could take a sample today, You could send it in, you could wait a few days, maybe a week, then you get it back, and then you can go back out and try to figure out where it was. And that's not really a great way, because by then, if it was a leaking tile or a spill, or it was just a huge influx of waterfowl on your field and then they left, you never know what it could have been. So that's one of the cons to using that as an indicator. Something else that you can get immediate results for would be much better. Fecal coliform can recolonize in some respects. So in other words, if you have some that is in a stream bed, that stream bed goes dry and then it starts filling back up, or you get a temperature shift, those can actually in some cases recolonize in certain cases or certain conditions. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of it. So you can suddenly get a high count, but there was actually no contribution. It was from something previous. You also can get very variable in-stream results. So we can take 2 or 3 samples from the same spot, and they can vary by as much as 25 to 50%, only because you just happen to catch a little plume coming down, or you have something like that. So there's a lot of variability in there. Also makes it challenging for looking at those things. And then you get the dilution effect. So even though it comes into a stream, you may have a really hot count, so you do have a direct discharge. But if you're taking your sample way down the stream, you can have so much dilution by that point that you have no idea that there is a discharge. So sometimes it's in-stream monitoring on a large scale. There's some pros, but there's also a lot of cons to it. So you just want to have some type of, conscious thought with it when you're looking at these types of results. So the next one I want to talk about is leaching to groundwater. And here, whereas fecal coliform is our indicator for surface water, nitrate is the indicator for groundwater. And this probably is a little bit hard for you guys to see, so I'll kind of go over it. This is from Department of Ecology. In their 2012, they put together an inventory of what they thought were the primary sources in Whatcom County for where was nitrate coming from. And the largest piece of the pie here was manure applied to crops. The next piece of the pie, this is fertilizers applied to crops. And when you think about those are both nitrogen. And nitrogen in the soil converts to nitrate. And nitrate is what your plants want. That's great. So that's what's not taken up by your plants, so what's there in excess. When it rains or you irrigate, that's what's pushed through the soil to the groundwater. So we're looking for what are our nitrogens here. The other sources, we have a little bit of atmospheric deposition. That's what I was talking about when nitrogen comes from airborne sources and just lays down or deposits somewhere and it goes through the same process. Lagoons, dairy lagoons was a small percentage, irrigation water, on-site sewage. So these are what they categorize as the major sources just by doing mapping. So they weren't able to really be able to tell exactly from where, what, how. This is just based on the mapping potential sources. But other sources not included here. Well, we have manure applied to crops. There was no talk about grazing. This can be cows, sheep, goats, horses, livestock, chickens. That can actually be, as I mentioned, we've probably got thousands of animals in our county, but you've got 1 or 2 or 3, and you may not think that's a source, but you add all those up, and it actually starts to expand quite greatly. Leaking septic systems. The county a couple years ago did a very brief survey of septics, and they probably, I want to say they looked at maybe 7% of the total available septics, and of that they had about 20% that failed. So if you take that and expand that out, there are a lot of septic systems out there that are aging and may have some repairs that need to be done that are contributing directly to those sources. So another important source, and they had on-site sewage, and those things kind of match up a little bit. Natural systems and wildlife, these things just naturally deposit. We get an influx, a huge migratory influx of birds every year here, as we all know, and they put down really hot manure. It's like chicken manure, kind of hot. So a lot of nitrogen in there that's being kind of put all over the county, and typically those are on our more kind of saturated soil types, so we're not as concerned with an immediate leaching of those as a runoff issue, but nonetheless it's also a source. How big the piece of the pie? I couldn't even say. That creating a very good inventory is really, really hard. So this is kind of what ecology thinks are those sources. And when we look at the pros and cons there, with nitrate being our main indicator, the pro is that from a monitoring standpoint, nitrate moves very easily in the soil. So it likes to be attached to water, and water is what kind of moves through your soil profile depending on the pore size. So as I talked about earlier, like sandy soils, there's a lot of air and a lot of pores in there. You have big coarse particles, and they don't really like smush together well, so you've got a lot of space. And so water moves through there, and it carries nitrate very easily. Whereas when you look at something like clay, those are really fine, tightly bound particles, and you have very little water movement that happens in there. So the nitrate leaching isn't nearly as great in those soil types. So when you do look at the mobility of it, nitrate will move straight through. One big problem as well is you can't differentiate sources of nitrogen. So you can measure nitrate in the groundwater, but you can't for certain say who is the contributor of that, what percentage is which of those different puzzle pieces, as I showed earlier. So it's, that is a little bit challenging in that respect. Natural soils produce a lot of nitrate, so forests, everything. Anywhere there's nitrogen and you've got deposition or degradation of any product that produces nitrogen, you've got that available to leach down to the soil. And the conversion rate is very variable, if you will. So we get our biggest contribution of nitrate to our groundwater in the fall. So we've got, in our county, we do have a ton of cropland, so it's valid to say that's probably a large piece of the pie if it's not managed well. But when managed well, if you have manure or fertilizer or any type of nitrogen product out there in the fall, and your crop growth is kind of decreasing at that time, or you've harvested corn or your annual crop off, whatever excess is there, at that time we start to get a lot of rain, and that rain just pushes it because your soil particles can't grab it or your crops don't need it, so it's available for movement. And so a lot of our new manure application guidance or fertilizer guidance is really thinking about what are your different soil types. Which of your soil types should you be stopping application on in, let's say, July or August versus going all the way through October, just to limit that, because you don't necessarily need all that excess nitrogen at the end of the year in certain fields, and you can get on those a little bit earlier than others that dry out a little sooner come this time of year, come our late winter, early springtime. So looking at all those pieces, there are ways, and I'll talk more about that, how we can adjust those different pieces. So I already kind of talked about this. Why is runoff a problem? It's the contribution. What folks look at, it's that eutrophication I talked about. That's that algae kind of green production in our waters. It's that turbidity, and that's the fogginess that happens with sediments in water courses. That low oxygen, toxicity, those types of things that are affecting fresh salmon, shellfish beds, wetlands, wildlife, other resources. What should also be put in here too is that when we've got those high nitrogen rates in groundwater, for instance, you're feeding that to your stock. So your cows are getting that excess nitrogen or nitrates if it's very high. That's not really great for them in a lot of cases at certain stages of production or gestation, or any other species. Or when you're applying that to your fields, you're actually over applying nitrogen in some cases if it's coming from your irrigation water as well. We don't typically test irrigation water here, but in some cases, typically if you've got a deep well, it's pretty low, but if you've got a more shallow well, you could have parts per million that you're adding from 10 to 70 in some small areas of our county. So it can actually be quite a bit of a contribution to your whole system. So that's also important to talk about. And then, and that's kind of the leaching rate there. The runoff part, again, that's more of a community issue, so you're not typically taking that water right back to your farm, but you may be a fisherman, or you may, drink that water or recreate in that water, and that's what's important to you directly, and that's that link there. Your families may be drinking that water, etc. And so what are the factors that lead to these events, or what can lead to this? And when we look from an agricultural production, number one, it's pollutant availability. If it's there, then it has the ability to move somewhere if we don't manage it correctly. So that's number one. Number two is improper application or grazing practices. If we're not putting out at the right rates or the right timing or on the right field, then again, you've got that, it leads back to that pollutant availability. These are really easy things to manage so far. The next one is weather events. You need something that's going to move that stuff. Certain times of year, July, we're not thinking about runoff whatsoever. We don't have rain coming, there's no flooding. Those types of things aren't on our minds, but come right now, this time of year or in the fall, it's that heavy precip coming. What can move? Am I more concerned about runoff or leaching at that time of year? Am I going to have flooding that's just going to grab all that sediment and move it? Or are you receiving a bunch of whatever's coming from the river as a contribution to your farm? You've got high water tables you have to worry about, wind movement, all those types of things. And then poor field conditions, and this has to do with your soil type, what's your slope, what's your surface cover and saturated soils, those types of things. So all of these things are really simple, but if we don't manage each one independently, but more importantly kind of together, that's when we can have one of these issues. But it's actually really, really easy to manage all these things. And we've got some ways, easy practices and easy tools now available to help you look at these things in a more holistic way, kind of all together on your farm. So before I talk about that, I want to talk about the regulation and monitoring of water quality. So this is what probably a lot of you are kind of interested in, who's doing what out there and how and all those things. And I wanted just what I've talked about so far is just talking about the why. So why is there regulation and monitoring of that in our county, and how is it going to make a difference? So we've got a lot of different agencies who monitor water quality, and this is mostly surface water, but also groundwater in our county. You've got EPA, does spot checks here and there, Department of Agriculture, Department of Ecology, you've got Whatcom County, you've got Department of Health. All of these folks not only monitor all sorts of things on your farm at different points and different pieces, and I realize it makes everything you do a little confusing, but these folks are also looking at water quality. Some of the non-regulatory agencies, I always had to point this out, are us, the Whatcom Conservation District, and our partners in our office, NRCS. We're non-regulatory. So it's important to be able to look at the difference there. And Whatcom County is 50-50, so there is regulatory there, and then there's a bit of non, but you've got both happening. How does water quality, what are the handful of regulations or ordinances that kind of affect you here? And you've got it starting at a federal national level. So EPA, in the early 70s, the Clean Water Act came into play. And this basically said, let's keep the water clean. This regulates discharges and water quality standards and all those different pieces. And then it's our state's responsibility, it's actually Department of Ecology's responsibility to make sure that that Clean Water Act is being upheld in our state, which is why they are the ones who typically go out and do water quality inspections. In our state, we also have the Department of Agriculture specifically only does the dairy program. So if you have a handful of horses or you grow berries or whatever, your main overlooking person is Department of Ecology. If you're a dairy farmer, the main person overlooking what you do is Department of Ag. But if you have a discharge or something else, or they suspect water quality, Department of Ecology can also come in and act as a regulatory agency next to them. So there is kind of, you got both going in there, but it's important to know there's a little bit of a differentiation there. And then in Whatcom County, two more things that came in the late 90s. There's the Critical Areas Ordinance. So this means if you are next to any type of a critical area, like a stream, for instance, particularly a fish-bearing stream or a marine stream area, then you must stay back specific distances as is written in that ordinance. If you have a farm plan, whether that be a dairy nutrient management plan or a farm plan if you're non-dairy, then you will adhere to whatever is in your plan. So you don't have to have 100-foot regulated critical areas setback. If your farm plans, you can have 30 because you're doing extra good management. So you either have one or the other. In the dairy cases, everyone has to have a nutrient management plan, and that's what you follow. And then there's also the manure spreading ordinance, which says you can or can't spread at certain times if you have fallow fields, etc., those types of things. So we have a handful of different things that kind of regulate water quality. And in our county, we've got a handful of folks doing water quality monitoring. As I mentioned, Department of Ecology, Department of Ag, Whatcom County, in cooperation, there's resources and a handful of other groups that also work with them. YR1 is the Water Resource Inventory Area, and there's a handful of folks in there that work together on having monitoring stations in our county that have been monitored for a really long time. And a lot of that, the collection of those samples and the analysis of those samples is done by LUMI. So you've got the college out there that's doing that work. USGS also does some sampling, but they're mostly like stream flow and temperature and turbidity and those types of things. They're not doing the fecal coliform monitoring. And then there's a handful of others, as I mentioned. So what does that look like? Here's a map of Whatcom County. And it's kind of, I know the colors aren't great, but we've got the different watersheds. Here's Sumas, and here's the Nooksack watershed. You've got the Drayton Harbor, Birch Bay watershed, and Lummi. And if you think about earlier when I talked about, these watersheds go this way, the Nooksack kind of all comes and empties here, and then Sumas goes up. So that's why I kind of talked about that earlier. And what you see, the blue dots are all marine monitoring sites. So those are for where all the shellfish beds are mostly, and they're monitoring up there. And then the red dots indicate the current monitoring, water monitoring sites. And the yellow dots are historic monitoring sites that aren't monitored by WIRE1 anymore, but some of these areas are occasionally monitored by WSDA or some other groups at periodic times. So I don't have all of them. So there are they'll go out and do spot checks here, or they will do, maybe for a few months, they'll do some intensive monitoring in an area and then move. There's been, the county has really stepped up their monitoring over here in Drayton Harbor in an effort to really identify sources and help people implement BMPs and then see if they can see that reduction in the water beds or in the watersheds. So there is quite a bit of monitoring going on all over the county. And you can access this information. It's totally open to everybody from different areas. In one spot you can get it is from our webpage at whatcomcd.org. We have this watershed health assessment map up that every month we get that data from WIRE1. That is a lot of these different monitoring stations all over the county. And we've got those broken into watersheds. And you can see the dots represent where that monitoring is done on at least a monthly or bi-monthly basis, depending on the time of the year. And we post those samples up so that you can see currently today what is the health of the watershed that I live in. So if you live right here, for instance, you would click here on the map. It's interactive, and when you click it, it pops up a box that says what the current sample was this month, and then you can look at what it was historically. You can say, wow, it's high. I wonder why. It's X time of year, and you can start thinking about it. Who could be contributing to that in my watershed? Should I talk to my neighbors? Should I do a self-assessment? What can I look at? And then some are doing really great certain times of the year, and you can say, great, that looks really good. Or you can just start noticing things at certain times of the year. What could be contributing? Is it, do we have a huge influx of waterfowl? Or, or is there aging septics? Or whatever it may be in your area. So it's just a little bit of a nice way to do some self-assessment there and see how these things fluctuate a lot during the year. It's really interesting. So here's that map again, as I mentioned. And this is where you can see that little graph that'll pop up when you click on it. As I mentioned, that sampling is conducted by WIRE1, and Northwest Indian College does the analysis of that. And they've been doing it for a really long time, so there's nice consistency there. Another place you can go is the WIRE1 website, and this is that very long kind of URL that you can get to, but if you just Google WIRE1, on here you can go to each one of their sites that they've got here. So when you click on Middle Fork, then it pops up a map of all the different monitoring, including USGS there, and you can get all their historical data if you just want to look back and see, what are those numbers? I'm curious about my watershed. So that data is publicly available. Again, Ecology also has their data publicly available. They only have a couple sample sites that's open to what they monitor, and these are the long-term sites. And not all these have fecal coliform. Some of them are just looking at stream flows or sediment, etc. But again, you can see all their data and what that looks like. And there's a few extra things. You can see exactly where those monitoring locations are. So all this data is out and about. And lastly, the Department of Ecology's 303D list. So this is where they've listed what are their critical area or critical water bodies. So sometimes it's just a stretch of stream, so part of Scott Ditch, for instance, or Cam or Nooksack, that's been listed high for something, whether that be Fecal Coliform or sediment, etc. So this information is also there. You would just click on that stream reach and it tells you, this parameter. So this section of 10 Mile Creek is high for bacteria, and it talks about why and all those types of things. So you can kind of see what are the water bodies in your area that are high, and maybe is it on your land or part of your land, does it go nearby? How can you help maybe reduce that problem? So there's a lot of information out there. And some of the pieces I want to talk about, though, is the reporting and interpretation of those water quality results. So as I talked about earlier about the pros and cons of different types of sampling, this also has some pros and cons with how we report that information and interpret that information. So typically you've got two ways of looking at surface water results. So when you're looking at those fecal coliform results that are posted up there, you either get raw data, meaning here's the sample that we took today and here's that number, or what's typically reported is something called the geometric mean. And while this is a little confusing, it's basically just a weighted average. So you're not taking, like your normal average would be like, you add up a bunch of numbers, then divide by how many that is. But this one actually takes into account those really high and really low numbers because maybe you had a dry stream bed or you had a discharge event, and it kind of gets rid of those. So it gives you a more like even keel average over time. And this is typically done on about a 30-point scale. So they take like the last 30 and then they just keep moving that along. Sometimes they do an annual, so you get 12 points. Sometimes they do 5-year or monthly, etc. So there's a lot of variation, and there is no real consensus on what exactly you report when you report a geometric mean. So when that's reported, it's always really important that you take a peek about how many data points is in this average that I'm looking at, so that I can understand that value. Because when you look at, as we report just the raw data on our website, you can see like, oh, it's green, it's blue, or it's green, it's red 1 month, and it goes here and it goes there. Sometimes that's way more important for you to get a now assessment versus this, kind of geometric mean just gives you a trend over time, but it doesn't give you all these spikes. And I'll show you what that looks like. So here's an example of that. So here is data that we're looking at. So the green data is, and this is from an actual site, this is Cam Creek, and this is Ecology's data. So we're looking, the green is the raw data. So this is all the points. You have, very high counts, sometimes you have extremely low counts and everything in between. And then this orange line is that 30-point geometric mean. And you can see there's actually, the trend is kind of the same, but it's actually pretty different. So here you get a big wall here, and that kind of mimics that, but you're not really seeing these high counts here. And what time of year was that? That's really important to know. Where was this? Why do we have so many high counts in a row? Was there something going on in that area? That's really good to know. Or why was this so low here for so long? Was this a drought year? Was there any flow in there? Very important to know, and you would never notice that on this geomean. In fact, what you see is it suddenly went up and then it stayed high and it kind of meandered, whereas here you actually see there was a huge cluster of maybe higher events and it was low, and then its general trend, if you look over time, has been that, wow, it was actually pretty decent here for quite a while. And then it slowly started going up, but here you see such a dramatic change, and that's because this is taking always that last 30. So you've got 30, 30, 30. So the point you see here is adding all those up, if you will. So it's a little bit different way to look at things. And in fact, here's how Ecology maps this exact same data. And you can see with their geomean, they've got huge changes. And then they give you two different trend lines that say, well, it got really great, and now it's getting really bad. Well, actually, you just had a lull because of a drought year. And had you expanded that out, it actually we would have leveled off at some point. So the interpretation of that data takes a lot more than just believing what you see immediately in a graph. You want to think about it a little bit. Same thing here with, this is a groundwater map by that Ecology put out as well. So that all these dots are, they do colors and sizes for the actual amount of nitrate they found in the groundwater. So if you see little dots of 10 milligrams per liter of parts per million, that's kind of the threshold and that is the regulatory threshold across the nation, where they say if you are above 10, then that is above the limit for human health concerns. So that's where they draw the line. So anything that you see orange or red is above that value. So we get quite a bit of that. And this, as you saw the aquifer earlier, so the purple is that larger aquifer where they're taking those samples. And so you see kind of areas where there's clusters of red, but really it's kind of all spread out. But what's interesting is when you look at these points as well, is you have to think about, well, where was that sample taken out of? And what is that value? What's the scale that they're using on here? And how do I know, if this red dot, how big of an area is that representative of, etc.? So you really want to think about those things. And so when we interpret water quality results, when you look at the surface water things, you want to think about what time of year is it? So is this the time of year where we've got a lot of rain, or is it in the middle of summer? And if it's the middle of summer and you have a really high fecal coliform number, well, the GeoMean won't show you that, but that raw data certainly will. And you can say, whoa, someone must have had a discharge event. I wonder what happened. Or if it's during our fall time where we're getting a ton of rain, and so you get a little bit of maybe contribution from a lot of sources, those numbers can be really high. So thinking about the time of year, very important, as well as that precipitation that's occurring and what are the potential sources in that watershed. And for groundwater, as I mentioned, it's the sample location, but more importantly are those well specifications. Is this a very shallow well that we're sampling at? So we're just looking at the top profile of the soil, in which case, yeah, it's probably going to be a little bit higher if we're not below the root zone, but most of those are. And what's the age of that well? Are you sampling from 50 feet down, in which case it'll probably be pretty clean? Is this a residential well or an ag well, etc.? There's a lot of different things you need to look at, and some of those can't all be correlated. Sometimes they take tap water samples, and that's part of it as well, instead of sampling from a well and where did the tap water come from. So thinking about these sources is just as important in interpreting that data, because it gives you a sense of like, oh, well, if that's from my well and I know where that well comes from and I have a high count, then I can do some self-assessment on that. Whereas if it's a tap water sample and it's, a mile away, you're like, oh, I don't think that, that's not me. How do I figure out what's coming from my potential sources? So important to think about those things. So what can you do in all these different pieces? Well, number one is take your own water samples. So if you're curious and you're looking at all of these like fecal coliform, this and that, and we have high numbers in your watershed, and you're like, I don't think I'm contributing to that, or am I? Is there a problem on my farm I'm unaware of or next to me? So very easy to take your own water samples, but you want to make sure that you do it right. And if you're curious to ever do these things, we've got some information on how to take a water sample, and you want to make sure that you pick a very representative spot, so you don't want to take it in a stagnant puddle, and you don't want to take it from the edge of the stream per se where you've got eddies or something. You want to make sure that you're taking it from the middle of the flow in a stream next to, downstream and upstream of what you're curious if it's a source or not. Because you want to make sure you're upstream to get what's coming in, and then right at that source or slightly downstream of it, so you know exactly what that source is, and the difference is what is coming from there. So really important, and don't contaminate your sample. That's the worst thing you can do is, you take that sample and then you have like, fumbly hands, and you touch the top and you had dirt on your hand, you just wiped it off or whatever, and suddenly you've got all sorts of stuff in that sample, and it's, you're going to get a weird result that's not really true of what that is. So always want to make sure you don't contaminate it, store and preserve it correctly. So typically if you're taking a fecal coliform sample, you want to go to the lab first and get the right container, or sometimes they'll deliver them. And they always have specific instructions on there depending on the lab you go to about how long you want to keep that. So sometimes if it's fecal coliform, you've got 4 to 6 hours to get that right to the lab so that you have accurate results. If you're doing a nutrient, do you want to know more about what's the nitrate out of your irrigation, for instance, and you've put a very, very clean bucket, you've collected water, and then you take a sample and you want to send it in. That one you've got maybe a little bit more time for nitrate. So it's important to know what you're sampling and what the lab requirements are. And that's always on their website. and you want to send it to an accredited lab. And if anyone, I've got some cards here for Exact Scientific, which is a lab. They're right in Bellingham. They'll do pickups here in the county if they've got enough samples, or you can do drop-offs. And we'll even work with you if you can get them to our office. We can get them to the lab for you as well. And they are accredited to do all sorts of this kind of sampling. They'll give you free sample containers, and then you can send it to them. You can do forage, manure, soil, all your soil samples. There's a lot of different labs around, but if you're going to do fecal coliform, you have to make sure it goes to an accredited lab. So they have to be certified, essentially, by Department of Ecology that they can run those tests appropriately. So some other things you can do on your land. So I'm just going to point out the few things that make the biggest difference for water quality. But you can do many, many things. But here are some of the biggest ones. And number one is planting cover crops. So this makes a huge difference for sediment transport off your field, as well as excess nitrogen loss. So, and this cover and or relay. So when you are putting in your corn this spring, you can get your relay crop in at the same time. It usually isn't a huge extra effort. Shouldn't cost you too much extra. And then later when you harvest, you're going to see that cover crop flourish. Some folks who do that, they'll either kill it or until it under, or harvesting it. And with feed prices as they are, harvesting an entire extra crop is a pretty great thing to be able to do. So, and we're working with WSU here this year on trying to find ways that you can kind of get rid of that corn stubble a little bit easier, because that's typically why folks don't like to harvest this stuff, because you get a bunch of dirt clods and corn, you know, old corn stubble and stalks and whatnot. So we're trying to find ways that we can actually reduce that, so you're just harvesting a great extra crop. You can silage it, you can green shop it if you're a small operation, you can get out there. So however you want to get that off, but utilizing that extra crop is going to be really valuable in the kind of economy changes and with the land base that we have, etc. So it's a really smart thing to do. In addition to significantly reducing sediment, typically, as I mentioned earlier, that corn is that really silty soil that we typically put corn on, and that stuff really moves. You get water sitting on it, you get a little extra water, and it just likes to find its own groove right out of your field. Maybe you've put a V-ditch in accidentally, or any other kind of way to drain water off of there. And so now you've got ditches full of sediment, you got to clean those often, and yada yada. So this is an easy way to solve a lot of problems. It keeps your soil there, keeps the nutrients there. Another one, and this one has 50-50 results depending on if you actually like them or hate them, is any type of a vegetative buffer. So if you've got a cornfield and you don't want to do cover crops for some reason, or you've got quite a bit of a slope that even cover crops won't help, you could plant some type of a filter strip or vegetative barrier or field barrier right around that field. You could have this in any field, and you could have a lot of different types. You could just do, if you also have a swale in the middle of your field that always moves and you know it's going to transport things, this acts as a filter. In other words, as nutrients kind of come into there, it's going to take that out, and by the time that water gets to its discharge point, it's going to be clean. So these can be engineered structures, vegetative filter strips that work very well. On a cornfield, as I said, on the edge, you can do some kind of a buffer here. Here's another example of that. Here's just a way to shade out streams, which is a nice way where you could do some type of a woody vegetation combo that's going to hold sediment out of your stream bed. So if you don't want to give up 30 to 50 feet, and maybe it's not necessary, you could give up 10 with a different design in there, and it can be just as effective. So you've got options to work with depending on what your circumstance in your field looks like. Another one is good grazing practices. So if you've got a couple horses or cows, or you're grazing your dairy cows, whatever it may be, having good rotations on your field so you're not grazing down to mud or dirt is really, really, really important. So that's the best way to eliminate any type of sediment that's going to come off of there. And fencing of those critical areas at certain times of the year. So in the summer, things are dry, you're fine. But maybe as we're moving towards that October time period, maybe you can just do a temporary fence along that swale to keep your animals and that manure out of it, so when the water starts flowing, it doesn't get to the ditch. So temporary fencing of high-risk areas is a great way to manage your grazing. You don't have to put in permanent fences if you don't want to. You can graze that during times it's appropriate, and then get them out of there when it's not. So very easy to manage those things. And then if you've got, let's say your horse is in a corral year-round, good pen management is important there. Don't let it turn into mud. Do some type of amendment on that surface so you don't have that. Or if you kind of just overwinter your animals, make sure that area, that heavy use area, has been hog fueled or gravelled or whatever it may be that works best for your situation. Of having something like a permanent filter strip, you could do something like a manure application setback distance. And this is primarily for your grass field. So a grass field is kind of a giant vegetative buffer or filter in some ways. But if you're applying straight up to the edge of that, then you've got your potential nutrient or whatever it is right up to the edge that can move off. So here, this is what we recommend, and this information again is on our website. There's a lot of information on there for you. And this is the different distances you want to stay back from a water body at certain times of the year. So in the summertime, you can get within about 10 feet of there to make sure that your crop is getting what it needs and that you've got great kind of vegetation production. Same thing with grazing. And then as we get closer to our heavier rainy seasons, September, October, then we want to be back about 40 feet. Because as our water, the predicted amount of precip we get in water movement, it takes about that far. The grass, etc., and taken up for those nutrients, so by the time the water is off the edge of your field, you don't have any kind of pollutants in there. And then if we get to our winter seasons, we're looking at 80 feet or more this time of year and into February, where we really do get, you've got saturated soils in a lot of cases, plus a little bit of rain is really going to allow things to move off. Or if you've got a slope, you just want to be farther back. So if you can follow this simple guidance that we give you like month by month by month, you're going to really decrease any potential you have off your grass fields to have a runoff event. So really easy and really simple. Here are just a handful of pictures of don't do this kind of a thing. Don't apply, you can see the green streaks, don't apply so close that you're applying in the ditch. That's pretty easy one. If you are going to have some type of when you've got a ditch nearby, make sure it's not full of blackberries or something else that's just choking it up and you're not getting any flow through there. Also not a great thing, that's easy to manage. Don't let your pastures become mud pits that just drain right off in your ditch. Don't dig ditches to drain a hole, because typically that's just taking a lot of sediment and or nutrients or other things with it that you don't necessarily want moved off your field. And again, don't let compaction happen on your field where you get runoff and then you get sediment dams. So just a few examples of, the don't do this kind of things, and because these things are all very easy for you to manage, and they've got really big impacts for you one way or the other, negative or positive, when you do or don't manage them appropriately. Another big one for applying fertilizer and manure, but we're going to talk more importantly about manure here, is that the timing, as I mentioned this earlier, and this was a talk I gave, and if you're curious about that, we've got all these talks videoed and cataloged, you can go back and watch this one. But I talked a lot about, depending on your soil type, what time of year should you be applying when we're thinking about either runoff or leaching. So you can really manage both of those. If you know your soil types, and every dairy at least has a map of all their fields and all your soil types, and if you're curious to do more, we can do risk management maps for you, and I'll show that in a minute, that actually highlights those high and low risk fields that you've got for different times of the year. So you can really know and understand. You probably already know them. It's us helping you verify that and helping you kind of figure out a good schedule for each one of those. But based on your soil type, sand, silt, and clay, if we look at things like infiltration and drainage rate, and that relates to runoff, sand doesn't really have a high runoff because it infiltrates so fast. So maybe we're not as concerned about this field from a runoff perspective. But something like clay, because it doesn't infiltrate or the water doesn't get into the soil as quickly, we surely are concerned about runoff events. But inversely, when we think about leaching, it's sand that's got the big leaching because that water goes straight through, and clay not so much. So at certain times of the year in the fall, it's those sandy soils we're really worried about all that. If we've got excess nitrogen, that it's going to go. and that also that time of year and in the spring when we've got saturated soils on those silt or clay fields, we've got that runoff. So very easy to just simplify those. So I'm concerned about these fields this time of year and these fields that time of year. And then manure application kind of correlates to that. For sandy soils, January through August is your best time. For silt soils, you're looking at somewhere between January and October, and you're going to have variations depending on how much silt you've got in there. Is it silt clay? Those are going to be bumped out maybe towards the October. Are they sand silt? Those are going to be maybe a little bit earlier because they have better infiltration and drainage rate. Whereas clay, you could be maybe April through October that you want to apply. So you may not be able to get on some of those fields till June. We've got a lot of really, really wet fields out in the Ferndale, et cetera, area, the South Fork, or even around Linden, et cetera. So those fields you can apply too much later in the season because we're not nearly as worried about them. As long as you have those either setbacks in place and or buffers, we're not worried about movement off of them if they've been managed correctly. And as I mentioned, there's that application risk management. So this is basically a map that highlights your high risk and low risk fields so you know what time of year you can get out to these. And this, as I mentioned, highly correlates to your soil types. And then prior to that, filling out a worksheet that just asks you a handful of questions. What's the forecast? One of the most important things you can look at, obviously. If we think about all those factors, the big one was precipitation. What's the weather? And how's that going to affect my either leaching? When we know leaching, we kind of want to catch that a few months ahead of time. We know typically when it's rain. But for runoff, that's definitely one, like, if you looked at it today, you would have thought, we have 2 weeks of nice weather coming up. That's great. You know, how do I have fields I can manage this time of year? Or, you know, if we got into February and everyone's itching for the February 15th, you know, date that historically you've been able to apply to, don't think about dates anymore. Look at the weather. If it's raining, you know, for a big chunk that time, wait. If it's clear and great, you got lucky that the timing worked out. So get dates out of your head and start applying more based on agronomics and your field conditions. And this worksheet kind of helps you work through that. So for every kind of block of fields you've got or individual fields, you just go through what's your soil moisture percent, is it going to rain, what type of manure application equipment you're going to use. Take 5 minutes to fill that out, and at the end it tells you the risk for applying to that field on that day under those conditions. So it's a nice way to do that evaluation. And again, this is on our website. It's just an Excel sheet, so it's pretty easy for anybody to use. You can also use that as your record keeping system. So if you are going to apply and you fill out that worksheet, after you apply, you just write on there how much you applied, and you can start putting those in a binder. And you've recorded all those important things that WSDA wants you to record, like the weather and your application equipment and yada yada. As long as you put the amount on there, you've got a great record keeping system started as well. So it's a pretty nice system. And if you've got more questions about that, that's something we can help you with in our office. Any of the planners, anyone can help you with this. Another tool that we've got for you is our real-time manure spreading advisory. So this is a real-time map we've got up, and it just at this point deals with runoff, but we're in the process of doing a leaching advisory as well. But basically you just go up there, and we've got it for the whole Puget Sound. So you just zoom in your area, zoom into where your field is, click on the map, and it pops up this graph for you that says, you know, today the risk is high, but 2 days out, our risk is really low. It's coming down for runoff, so you can plan ahead. As long as your field conditions are good, your soil moisture is low, so we don't have saturation or runoff, and some of the other conditions are good on that field, you know that the risk for the precipitation runoff event is going to be really low. So it's a nice way to plan. And this was from a couple months ago, but if you pulled this up today, the whole thing is green. So if your fields are appropriate, the conditions for the weather support good application right now. So, but your field may not, which is why after you look at this, then you do that worksheet to figure out on a field-by-field basis. And some of the other things that are on the sheet, so in addition to the risk, we give a real-time manure spreading guidance. So I'll type something up, giving you guidance that time of year to say, you know, this is valid for these types of fields, or watch out for this, or now's a good time to be thinking about planting cover crops, or you better apply tomorrow by the latest. There's a huge storm event, or there's a huge storm event coming, but a block of nice weather after that. So postpone for 4 days if you can, etc. So there's always some type of guidance to help you make better management decisions on there, so you're not going out at a bad time. Same applies for grazing, etc. You can use this for those activities as well. And with that, that is pretty much all of it was a lot of information, guidance, tools, what's available to you, how you can access those things. So it's quite a bit.